go ahead.
All right. Welcome tonight to our Zoom event. My name is Mike Grunold. I am the chairman of Freedom Defense Canada, and we're glad that you have joined us this evening. I'd like to remind you of a couple of things before we get started. First of all, we want to encourage those of you who are attending this event but are not members of FDC to please consider joining our ranks. As we have more membership, we're able to do more things and provide both Zoom speakers and also live speakers at other events. So please join us. Secondly, most of you are aware of our Speaker Series fundraiser. We would like to encourage you to consider donating to the project and also send your ideas about speakers that you think we should consider for our Speaker Series. And finally, please support FDC's social media presence. Check out our regular Facebook posts and like, comment, and share those. Go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. And also we have recently set up Substack and Rumble. So please check those out, subscribe, and follow us there as well. So with that out of the way, I'd like to turn it back to Perry for some further instruction about etiquette and so forth. So Perry.
Yes, I just want to explain the etiquette of these kinds of events. So in order to create an atmosphere of mutual respect, we ask that you mute your mics. After the presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session, and I'll explain all the details of that when we get to that point of the event. So muting your mics will make sure that we don't get any competing noise or ambient noise or interruptions. So thanks very much for doing that. And back to you, Mike.
Okay, with all that out of the way, let me get to the main event. We are grateful to have as our guest speaker tonight, Harrison Faulkner. Many of you will know him from his work with True North. I would say arguably one of the most important news outlets in Canada these days in terms of their fact-based reporting and overall journalistic integrity. Mr. Faulkner is a digital media producer, a journalist and reporter with True North, helping to manage their social media operation, producing the Candace Malcolm Show, and also hosting Ratioed. Harrison's work has focused on, among other things, campus issues, conservative activism, and civil liberties. He studied journalism at Ryerson University. Harrison, I'll leave it to you to introduce your talk this evening. We're delighted to have you, and we look forward to what you have to share with us. So without further ado, it's all yours, Harrison.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to Freedom Defense Canada and everyone here who has joined us tonight. When I got the email from Perry about speaking to everyone about, in particular, Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, and digital ID, I knew that it wouldn't just be focused on those two things, that it would be a much broader discussion about really what we're witnessing in this country right now, which is what I've coined as the digital seizure of Canadian freedom. Bill C-11, when it comes to what we're seeing in the online space, particularly, is the tip of the spear. And we're going to get into that. But as you'll soon see, when I talk about Bill C-11, the Online News Act, I view C-11 as a package of one piece of three pieces of legislation. Bill C-11, the Online News Act, is of course one part of it. Another part of it is Bill C-18. That is currently the reason why you're not able to see any news on Instagram for those of you that are on Instagram, and why many of you are struggling to see any news on Facebook right now. Now, the other part of this is going to be about digital ID. It's looking increasingly likely that as we speak, the introduction of digital ID isn't going to be something that legislators are going to vote on in each province. It looks as though it's going to be something that's just forced on us all, whether we like it or not. And I think it's safe to assume with this crowd that most of us aren't big fans of digital ID. Now, I prepared a presentation for us to just kind of allow me to walk through how I want to discuss this. So bear with me for a second. I'm going to share my screen and get the... Hold on. That's it. Share this. Can everybody see my title shot here? The digital seizure of freedom in Canada. All right, we're all good, and everyone can also see me as well. That's not the most important part. The part on the screen is what's most important. We just want to make sure we've got everything here sorted. So at any point, if you can't see my screen or can't hear me, just interrupt me and let me know so we can make sure everyone else can listen. So as I said, this is going to be about the digital seizure of freedom in Canada, what we're witnessing right now. In summary, I'm going to talk about whether or not really what we're seeing in this country when it comes to comes what the government is doing and digital ID and obviously what we're seeing on the internet, whether or not it's benign, as the government likes to tell us, or if it's dangerous, or if what the activists, free speech activists, journalists, and people around the world, including the social media companies, are telling us is true. They all say that what we're seeing is disastrous and it's a problem. And the government is telling us, no, it's not a problem. Trust me, we're doing this for good causes. All right, once that's sort of out of the way, we're going to discuss what Bill C-11 is in the details. Then we're going to talk about Bill C-18 and the final piece of this three-headed censorship monster being the yet-to-be reintroduced online harms bill. This was a bill titled C-36, but it was introduced just before the election in 2021. And when that came in, the bill was made dead, and it has yet to be reintroduced. But we know it's a liberal promise, so it's coming right around the corner. Once that's out of the way, we're going to be talking about digital ID. No conversation about digital ID is complete without talking about central bank digital currencies. In my opinion, that's really what is behind the push to enforce the digital ID infrastructure we're now seeing across the country. And finally, we're going to talk about what all of this together really means. All right. So let's talk about Bill C-11. Bill C-11, which has received a lot of media attention, is essentially a bill that is going to promote Canadian content. That's what the government is telling us. At its core, however, as we're going to see with all of these pieces of legislation and this digital takeover, the government has always packaged it in language that is supposed to convince Canadians that it's actually a good thing. That's where I get into this, is it benign or is it dangerous conversation. When it comes to C-11, the government says it's all about promoting Canadian content, making sure Canadians can have access to Canadian content, which apparently we can't already. That being said, content creators and activist groups and journalists and basically, most of the media in this country have all said that it is going to censor content. It says censor the government, forget that. Censor content, censor user-generated content. We're going to get into that later. In the case of Bill C-18, this is the bill that essentially aims to force Facebook and Google to pay struggling news companies, right? This is how the government says it, struggling news companies, money every time a link to their news is published. The government says it's about funding local journalism. In reality, social media companies and the usual suspects, as we always say, journalists, activist groups, they have all said that it's going to restrict access to news. Most importantly, it's Facebook and Google who have said, if you do this, it is going to restrict Canadian access to news. And that's what we're seeing. So here you have the government saying it's going to fund local journalism and keep local journalism alive, which is something I think we can all agree on is a really important part of our country. But on the other hand, you have everybody else saying this is going to be terrible. This is going to restrict access to news. Same thing with C-11. It's going to fund Canadian journalism. It's going to fund Canadian content. When in reality, everyone is saying it's going to censor the internet. Finally, with the online harms bill, what does the government say? The government tells us that this is going to restrict the spread of online hate. It's going to stop people from feeling attacked, and it's going to clean up those comment sections online from making people feel uncomfortable. In reality, free speech advocates, journalists, and everybody else is saying that this online harms bill is going to criminalize online dissent. It's going to restrict our rights. It's going to restrict our freedom of speech, which is already heavily restricted, and make it even worse. We're going to get into online harms directly just later on. All right, now we move on to digital ID. What does the government say? Well, the government tells us digital ID is going to make our lives easier. It's going to basically streamline all of our operations and help us all advance into the truly the 21st century, as they say, which is kind of dystopian in itself. But again, everyone else is saying that this is going to track our lives, track our purchases, and be the beginning of the end of freedom as we know it. And again, what do they say about central bank digital currencies? It's going to make spending easier. Most of us don't use cash these days. We use our debit and credit cards. So why don't we just go headfirst into a cashless society? It's going to make spending easier. That's what the government says. Meanwhile, everyone else says that it will give government complete control over our spending. We've all seen what this looks like. We saw it during the Freedom Convoy. The government have already proven to us that they can't be trusted when it comes to our money. They will simply seize our bank accounts, freeze our money that is not just for us, but for our families, if it turns out we do something the government doesn't like. All right, with that out of the way, this sort of benign or dangerous conversation, let's really get into the details of what C11 is all about. C11 essentially seeks to force social media companies and streaming platforms, that would be your Netflix, your Amazon Prime, your Apple, Spotify, any company that engages in streaming content, getting content from the source to the listener. It's going to force every single one of those streaming platforms to fall under strict CRTC guidance. And what is this guidance going to do? Well, it's going to promote, as they say, promote Canadian content. In reality, what that means is the CRTC will have to take control of algorithms. These algorithms are what determine what content you see when you log on to YouTube, for example. The CRTC is going to take control of these algorithms to force content that the government deems to be Canadian on top of what you're seeing. So this would be your CBC News, your CTV, your Global News. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Netflix, what that would look like is any movie company that has complied with strict CRTC guidelines about making sure there's an adequate amount of French and English producers on the production staff, making sure they've ticked all the boxes in terms of, there's got to be enough Indigenous people on the production staff, and there's got to be enough equity and diversity. I mean, all of these things go into what the CRTC is going to be able to determine what is Canadian content. Now, in my introduction, they discussed who I'm part of True North. I can tell you there is not a single thing that True North does which is not Canadian through and through. Every single news article we write is written by a Canadian, or someone who is a Canadian permanent resident, I should say. Every single news story has a Canadian angle. When it's written by a Canadian, edited by a Canadian, and published by a Canadian. The same goes for all of our video content. But rest assured, when C11 is fully enforced, when the CRTC has fully grabbed power of the algorithms, True North is not going to be promoted as Canadian content. Instead, what will be Canadian content? Well, that, of course, will be your CBC, your Global, your CTV News, that sort of thing. At the core of C11 is this idea of whether or not user-generated content will be censored and will be controlled by the CRTC. What have the government told us from day one? That user-generated content is not at all in the scope of the bill. Just take a listen if you all can. Hopefully this comes clear. Take a listen at this montage of government officials telling us that actually user-generated content will not be in the bill. And by the way, user-generated content is what you would post on Facebook, what I would post on Facebook, on Twitter, X, as we want to call it that now, or YouTube. Anything that is posted by a user is user-generated content. And the government told us it would not be in the bill. Take a listen.
To users. Bill C11 quickly outlines that the regulator will have no power to regulate the everyday use of social media by Canadians.
I guess very briefly, it's really disappointing to see the misinformation back on C11 with respect to user-generated content. It is not part of C11.
That it's already very explicit that user-generated content is not affected by this piece of legislation. And everybody knows that user-generated content was never the intention here. It was the intention about getting to the web giants.
My understanding is
Well, you guys get the picture, right? The government can tell us this is not going to be in the bill. When the bill came to the Senate said, hold on a minute, user-generated content is in the bill, and we want to make sure, since you've told us all this many times it won't be in the bill, we'll put forward an amendment that you can accept, which will explicitly restrict the CRTC from censoring user-generated content. Turns out 2 Liberal senators took it upon themselves to introduce this amendment. And what did Pablo Rodriguez do? Well, as you can all see, he rejected the amendment. So he has no problem telling people that user-generated content will not be in the bill. Don't worry about it. When it turns out it is in the bill and senators tell him to take it out, he rejects the amendment. It gets awkward when Pablo Rodriguez specifically told Vashi Kapellos that any amendment which impacts the legislation will not be accepted. Meanwhile, we just heard Pablo Rodriguez and the Liberals tell us that user-generated content was not in the bill. So you would think that an amendment striking user-generated content from the bill would be totally fine for him to accept. But listen to what Pablo Rodriguez says in this clip to Vashi Kapellos, specifically about these amendments.
Amendments that you've already looked at that you have decided to reject?
Well, we'll see when the bill comes back, because I can't, it's in the Senate. I don't think the
They
Senate
talked a lot about what those amendments are.
But there are amendments that have zero impact on the bill, and others that may have some, and those we will not accept.
So we won't accept amendments that impact the bill, and we're told that, again, user-generated content is not in the bill. Obviously, as you can see, they passed the legislation with user-generated content in the bill. What does that mean for Canadians? Well, essentially, that means, like I said at the beginning, anything you post is going to be captured by the CRTC. It's going to be put in front of a government regulator to determine whether or not it's Canadian enough to be put up on top of your feed. Excuse me. All right, now we move on to Bill C-18. As I said at the beginning, this is the reason why if you go on Instagram right now, most of the news you see on Instagram, you won't be able to see. Instead, all you'll see is what you see on my screen. People in Canada can't see this content in response to Canadian government legislation. News content can't be viewed in Canada. I mean, that graphic alone is just, it could have been used in the Soviet Union. It's Orwellian. This idea that because of Canadian content, you can't see the news. Specifically, the government was wanting to make sure that they could get Facebook and Google to pay news companies every time a link was posted to that platform. If you think about it, it's completely unsustainable. Why would Facebook and Google ever accept this piece of legislation? Facebook, in their minds, views themselves as a free platform that disseminates news. For True North, Facebook hugely helps us. And I can say the same for any other independent media outlet. Social media is what is part of our business model. It's how we get our news to the market. If you think about Bill C-18, however, Bill C-18 is essentially just another example of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government finding ways to get more money into the pockets of these struggling legacy media giants. It's the same with C-11. They can't compete with independent media like True North, like Rebel, you can name a bunch, Western Standard, Counter Signal. They can't compete with the little guys who are outsmarting them in the digital market. So they're trying to bend the rules, twist the game, and make it so that the old guys who are struggling, this would be your Globe and Mail, your Toronto Star, your CBC, your Global News, they want to make sure the old guard can beat out the new guard in any way possible. With C-11, it's about tweaking the algorithms. With C-18, it's about either forcing Google to give money to the Globe and Mail, to the Toronto Star, or saying, no one can use Facebook anymore, and everyone has to revert back to their old sources, that being, of course, the old guard. Fundamentally, it is about making sure more money can go into the pockets of the legacy media who propagandize for Justin Trudeau all the time, and making sure to cut the business model out of the independent media. And independent media are the ones that are holding Trudeau to account right now. It's really dangerous, really pernicious stuff. And I believe Facebook and Google are right to try and push the government back on this. Many people will try and make it out to seem as though Facebook and Google are attacking Canada. I see it the other way. Facebook and Google have repeatedly said they're doing this for Canadians, to make it known that, as a matter of fact, the government can't just force whatever they want on these companies because it's going to have severe impacts on everybody else. Now, it's not all bad because, as I said, even though independent media can't play on the digital space. No longer can the old guard as well. That's why you can't see CBC News. You can't see Globe and Mail. You can't see CTV and Global on Instagram. So Trudeau has managed to also take away access for his own people as well. The last piece of this censorship three-headed monster is the Online Harms Bill, originally introduced as Bill C-36, but it is yet to be reintroduced under this parliament. This is really dangerous stuff. This might be, as a matter of fact, the most destructive piece of legislation on the freedoms of Canadians as we know it. The Liberal government have no problem telling the world that they plan to do this. If you go to their website right now, you'll see this exactly. Going back to this benign or dangerous conversation, this is how the Liberals try to talk about the Online Harms Bill. Within its first 100 days to combat serious forms of harmful online content, specifically hate speech, terrorist content, content that incites violence, child sexual abuse material, and the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, this would make sure that social media platforms and other online services are held accountable for the content that they host. This legislation will recognize the importance of freedom of expression for all Canadians and will take a balanced and targeted approach to tackle extreme harmful speech. Whenever the government tells you they are concerned about preserving your rights and freedoms, that is when you know to have your guard up seriously and really be paying attention. Now, the Canadian Constitution Foundation sees this bill much differently than the Liberal government does, of course. I'm not going to read all of this, but I want to highlight just some parts of this. This was their press release when the bill was introduced back in 2021. This legislation will impact the ability of Canadians to engage in debate on subjects that are unsettled, giving government and unelected tribunal bureaucrats even greater control over Canadians' expression will erode our fundamental rights, which have already been struck a serious blow by Bill C-10, which is Bill C-11. While hate speech is abhorrent and must be condemned, Bill C-36 will cause a whole new set of harms. The balance is all wrong, and this legislation should be rethought entirely. Now, before I go to digital ID, I want to just give some more context into Bill C-36. Both the Canadian Constitution Foundation and the Liberal government and the Liberal Party in this instance haven't really told you what this is all about. Bill C-36, if someone, this is how it play out. If you engage in what someone else determines to be hateful content or any online speech that is deemed to incite or foment hatred of a certain group or an individual, that grieved individual can file a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. In that instance, which we all know the Canadian Human Rights Commission are completely neutral arbiters and they would never be extremely biased to one side, of course. In that instance, someone who has just written a comment on Facebook or written a tweet or done anything at all digitally, and they are accused of parroting this hate speech, that person will be hauled in front of a human rights tribunal and potentially forced to pay a major fine. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars here if this legislation goes through. And in particular, the Liberal government will want to tell you that this is about holding social media platforms accountable for hate and not actually targeting the individual, not targeting Canadians' freedoms. That's not accurate at all. This is about making sure that Canadians are not able to debate, as the Canadian Constitution Foundation says, unsettled topics. In your mind, I'm sure you can imagine right now how this would play out. For example, what would happen back during the Freedom Convoy if C-36 was in place? What would happen if throughout this entire year if C-36 was in place? Many of you would be unable to say the things you're currently able to say online because the harms and the punishment would be immense. It would be severe. You can imagine the effect this would have on free speech in Canada is substantial. So that's really the three-headed monster of what we're seeing with online censorship. C-11, C-18, and the yet to be reintroduced C-36, the Online Harms Bill. The danger of this is immense. It truly is. And anyone who's paying attention, groups like this and other groups and journalists should be paying attention to this as much as they can and really doing as much as they can to stop it from happening. Let's move on to digital ID now. You know, every single province, except for a few, really the small provinces, as far as I can tell, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, some of the territories, they have yet to introduce their form of digital ID and inform their province and the people in their province that this is coming, whether they like it or not. All the other provinces, Ontario, British Columbia, Quebec, Alberta, all the big provinces, they have already told their populations that this is coming. In the case of British Columbia, it is going to be called your British Columbia digital wallet. In Ontario, they don't care. They just call it a digital ID straight up. In Quebec, they call it your digital wallet as well. Governments, however, they're not that dumb. They do sound dumb. They don't say smart things, but the people behind the scenes are paying attention to what's going on. They know that the public don't like the smell of a digital ID. After all, we did go through COVID. We did see exactly how government can be weaponized against us and the dangers it poses to our freedoms. So what have they done with this digital ID stuff? Well, every time they post about it, they make sure to really tell us that this is not going to track us. This is not going to track your location. You don't have to worry. It's not going to be stored in a central database, they say. As you can see here, this is what the Ontario government has on their website under the digital ID. And again, back to our benign or dangerous conversation, the government always likes to lead with the good stuff. Oh, it's going to be convenient. It's going to make your lives easier. You don't have to worry about keeping all of those cards, your driver's license, your passport, all this stuff. Why would you want to have that? Just put it all on your phone and it'll be fine. So the government says it'll be convenient. It'll be secure. It'll be privacy preserving, which I find particularly funny. It'll be verifiable. It'll be in your control. You will have full and complete control over what bits of your information you want to share. And of course, it'll be voluntary. I like how they put that one there as well. As I said, also, they remind us that it will not be stored in a central database. It will not track you, and it will not be used without your permission. This is what it looks like in British Columbia, if you want to see. The BC wallet, they call it. It's going to be confidential. You'll have instant verification. It'll be easy to adopt for everybody, and more control over personal information. Now, before we get into the conversation about digital ID and the digital dollar, we'll talk about digital ID just on its own. As I said before, we all lived through COVID. We saw the worst attack on our freedoms as Canadians we've probably ever seen in our lifetime. What did we see in particular, though? We saw, for example, the forced downloading and forced upon us the forced usage of the ArriveCan app. The ArriveCan app was a digital ID program. It was sort of the original digital ID. And they got a perfect test run because nobody really was able to oppose using it. What happens, for example, if you traveled without your ArriveCan app in and out of the country during COVID? I can tell you, for example, what happened to me. My fiance is from Boston, and we live together in Toronto, and we frequently go back to see her family in Boston. And by this point, I had been completely fed up with the use of ArriveCan and what I consider to be an egregious attack on our freedoms. So I just said to myself, you know what? Forget it. I'm not even going to bother with ArriveCan. I'm just going to see what happens when I cross the border at Toronto International Airport. And what happened was you go into the border guard. They ask you if you've done your ArriveCan. If you say no, they immediately put a mark on your paper and your declaration, and they don't ask you any more questions. They send you to a different desk. I'll tell you, when you go to that desk, all they do is keep hounding you and screaming at you to fill out the ArriveCan app. If you don't fill out the ArriveCan app, you get a multi-$1,000 fine. But think about that. If you open up your first page of your passport, if I have it here, I'll do that. The passport specifically states that you as a Canadian shall not be, your rights to enter your country shall not be infringed. You shall have free passage in and out of your country. You can't be blocked from entering your own country. That is exactly what they did. They fined you for not entering your own country if you didn't fill out the ArriveCan app. Why do I say this? Well, it is exactly what the government is now telling us digital ID won't be. It is exactly what they did to us. Now, even further, Once you upload all this information, once you upload your driver's license, once you upload your health card, once you upload all of this important data, and that data, as we saw, can be used by private businesses like restaurants, for example, who wanted to scan QR codes. Well, this is all about getting your data, having access to your data. And who wants your data? Well, of course, the government wants your data, but private businesses want your data. And there's a lot of money to be made when it comes to all of that. Also, in the case of Quebec, they don't really mind just being straight up and honest with every Canadian about their true intentions. If you go onto the Quebec Wallet website right now, they will tell you that they are working with banks to get your financial services added to your digital ID. Again, they want you to be able to pay for things with your digital ID. They want you to be able to do everything with your digital ID. That, of course, is going to be given, that data is going to be given to private businesses. Anyone who you use, anything you pay, anyone you pay will have that data when it comes to you using your digital ID for payment. So this is where we get into the issue of digital ID and the dollar coming together. Quebec will tell us they want to add financial services to the digital ID. Ontario isn't there yet. BC isn't there yet. But I mean, come on, guys, they're calling it a wallet. What do you do with your wallet? You store your money in it. Of course, it's coming, and it's going to be merged with finance. Now, I want to show you this video. This video was from 2019. So they had this in the works. They've had this in the works for a long time now. This is from the Canadian Bankers Association talking to everyone about the importance of a, quote, federated digital ID. This federated digital ID, as he says, will make it easier for us to go about our daily lives. It will give access to the data that is most important to the people in charge of us. Just take a listen to this video and think about the implications of what we're looking at here.
A federated digital ID ecosystem developed in collaboration with Canada's best and brightest talent from our banks, telecommunication companies, law enforcement, and government. It would have the power and security to store every Canadian's electronic identity and attributes. Canada's banks are perfectly situated to help lead the creation of a federated digital ID system between government and the private sector. The World Economic Forum agrees that banks and financial institutions should lead the path forward for digital ID.
So there you go. The banks and the governments should work together to form this digital ID. And also the question should be asked, why haven't governments introduced this digital ID in the form of legislation so that our elected officials can go on the record voting for this? I don't think we were asked in Ontario and British Columbia and Alberta and Quebec whether or not we wanted this. I don't think we ever have had a choice when it came to this. This seems to be something that was just decided for us. So now we're getting into the realm of the digital dollar, all right? This digital dollar, hold on. There we go. This digital dollar, central bank digital currency, as they say, is going to be working in tandem with this digital ID. Because as we're moving toward what the central bank calls a cashless society, everything will be tracked, every purchase will be tracked. And once you, as this guy says, combine that with all of your attributes and your important data, again, just imagine the implication. Just think about what we're going to see. It's funny, you see, anytime people talk about the CBDCs as this central bank digital currencies and digital ID, well, what are people called by people who are not paying attention? Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're living in cuckoo land. You're not being honest about what's really happening. Well, it's tough when people say that because these videos are coming from the actual source. We're pulling this stuff from the provincial governments. In this case, in this video you're about to see, this was a video published by the Central Bank of Canada just about 5 months ago. This was on top of a public tweet that the central bank wrote on social media, encouraging every Canadian to engage in a survey about their thoughts of embracing a central bank digital currency. And listen, as you'll see in this video, they always say to us, oh, don't worry, this will not replace paper money, but it will in fact just enhance our daily lives. Again, going back to this benign or dangerous question. Take a look at this video. This is from the Central Bank of Canada just 5 months ago. And again, they call people conspiracy theorists for being concerned about this stuff. It's unbelievable.
Canadians pay for everyday things is changing. Some are using less cash in favor of other payment methods. To keep up with the changing ways that people pay, the Bank of Canada is exploring a digital Canadian dollar, also known as a central bank digital currency.
There we go. The central bank is exploring the central bank digital currency. Again, it's not difficult to see how dangerous this is. We've all lived through it. We all saw it with the Freedom Convoy. We've seen the governments exercise complete authority, which they shouldn't have, they should never have, over our personal finances. And what's to make us believe that they're not going to do it again? Well, I want to show you what American billionaire Steve Forbes said specifically about these central bank digital currencies. You're not alone if you're concerned about this. In fact, this man who's basically, won the game of American finance sees the danger too, and he's a billionaire. Take a listen to this video and this dire warning of what CBDCs can bring.
CBDCs would give officials a powerful tool of control and manipulation. It would be an irresistible drug for central banks trying to direct the economy. If you have undesirable political views, you might not be able to access your money, since traditional cash would be outlawed and your digital cash would be in a government-approved digital wallet. Congress should immediately hold hearings on the subject of central bank digital cash and ban the Fed from creating a digital dollar. Government digital cash is a formula for tyranny.
It can't be easy put out easily right there. It's as plain as day, a formula for tyranny. You can't allow the government to get their hands on our money. But that's what this is all about, isn't it? That is what this is all about. It's what it's all about when it comes to C11, C18, and C36. The government getting their hands on the last frontiers of freedom. It is what it's all about when it comes to digital ID and what it's all about when it comes to a CBDC. It's about the government getting their hands and completely seizing control of these crucial parts of our lives. So we're getting close to the end of my presentation, and so we've got a lot of time for questions, and we can discuss this as a group. But I want us to think about what all of what we've seen today put together looks like. And I'm going to play this video, and you'll see that this video is set in China. And we'll talk about this video afterwards. But in my opinion, this is where we are headed as a country when all of these things are happening to us at this current time. Quickly, before I play this video, can everybody hear the audio on the videos I've been playing? Just put a thumbs up if you can. Okay, great. All right, this is the final video here. I'll twist my mic even to make sure it's closer.
They're constantly monitored by facial recognition cameras that are able to instantly put a face to a name. Now the Chinese are also ranked. The cinema names and shames people considered untrustworthy, plastering their details, even their addresses, across big screens.
That is the Chinese social credit score system in full force, right? You've got control of your money, which the government can turn off and turn on as they choose if you're being a good citizen. You've also got complete control over what you say online. Say the wrong thing, well, your face will be blasted on a cinema screen, a literal cinema screen, with your address underneath it for everyone to name and shame you. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that when you put all of this together, this is where we're heading. We're heading toward a Chinese social credit score system, and it's happening before our very eyes. It's not just happening in Canada, it's happening in the United States too. But we have a duty here as Canadian citizens to do our utmost to stop this from happening. In conclusion, I want us to think about this sort of as a squeeze on our freedoms. Let me just end my screen share here, if I can. Hold on. I think I can do it right here. No. Anyway, let me see if I can end my screen share in some way. But we can do it. There we go. I think someone else is able to do it. All right. You know, think about this as a squeeze, right? We've got the internet on one side, you've got our finances on the other, and the government is taking as much control on either side as they can. And before we know it, like frogs in a boiling pot of water, we will eventually be boiled and we won't even be able to pay attention to it. So it's very important for groups like Freedom Defense Canada to be doing the work that everyone is doing. It's very important for people on this call to be aware of what's happening, as I'm sure many of you are. Hopefully this was just a refresher. But although times are really tough in this country, the government appears to have made it as difficult as possible for us to actually face what's happening to us, because it's so difficult just to put food on the table, just to get by day after day. That is, of course, at the exact same time that they're ramping up this seizure of our freedoms. So it's incredibly important. Although we haven't seen it yet, I think we are going to see Canadians really step up the fight and show their disapproval of what's happening in the streets, the same way we did during the Freedom Convoy. My hope is that that is just around the corner, and hopefully we can see a really strong fight against what we're seeing happening to our freedom. So with that, I know it's a little early. We've got quite a few minutes left, but I don't want to talk for too long. I want to open it up to the floor, and thank you all for listening, and hopefully all the multimedia elements were able to come through and everyone was able to enjoy it. But that's it, everyone. So thank you guys for listening, and happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Harrison, for your presentation. That was just amazing. It seems like the response to our reality is beginning to happen. People are starting to wake up a little bit. There is some pushback on various issues, but I think what you did for me in particular was simply by pulling all these things together, you realize they're not separate, they're not unconnected realities. They belong to a larger picture. And I think it's really important that we understand there's a package here. And if you look at the package, it's really obvious that our government does not mean well for us. They honestly do not. And so we can respond to that. But I don't want to take up other people's time for questions. At this point, what we would like to do is Perry's going to enable the chat box for your questions, so you can ask your questions there. And then Perry will give further instructions about our Q&A time overall. So I'll hand it back to you, Perry.
Thanks very much, Mike. So the next thing I'd like to do is describe how we proceed with this. So please keep your mics muted for the time being, at least. And we're going to go to the chat box for your questions. If you have questions, please write them in the chat box, and then I'll convey the question to Harrison. Depending on the number of questions, I might combine two questions on the same topic so he can answer them much more efficiently. And if questions become manageable, or we just prefer to do this, we can go to an open mic. And if we go to the open mic, please use the, let's see, where are we here? Please use the reactions function on the bottom or top of your screen so that you can put up a virtual hand. If you use your real hand like this, I may not see you. Okay, so is the chat box open? That's the question. Everybody see the chat box? I hope so. Okay, so please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box. I do have a question right now that's come up. And this is from Hal for you, Harrison. It was mentioned that hate speech is bad. My question is, who decides what hate speech is, if not some leftist?
Well, at the moment, it is going to be some leftist. The reality is that the hate speech guidelines are being written by the Liberal government, which is obviously in coalition with the NDP. And anything, you know, if it's not lefty enough for the NDP are going to make it more lefty, of course. Yeah. Then it goes in front of a human rights tribunal. And as I said before, the expectation that a human rights bureaucrat is going to be, impartial and be and judge language on its face and not with their own bias, I think is a pipe dream. So it is being written by extreme leftists. I would actually go even further than that, though. These are ideologues. These are people that really view, I think, see Marxism as their North Star. And it's really dangerous. So it's going to be written, it's going to be controlled, and it's going to be monitored all by ideologues, extreme left-wing ideologues.
Thanks for your answer. From Richard, the intangible nature of the digital system itself causes problems in making people aware of these potential digital challenges. So how do we communicate these challenges to everyday friends and family? How do we let them know that this is happening?
It's a great question. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to, in this world we live in right now, to convince people really of anything, quite honestly. Look at all these different issues. I mean, majority of people just won't be convinced to change their opinion no matter what you put in front of them. I think what's important is to show that it's, when it comes to online censorship, the people who are speaking out against this are not all conservative politicians. They're not all right-wing groups. It's left-wing groups too. I mean, Open Media, for example, which is sort of the leading advocacy group fighting back against this stuff, they're very liberal. Andrew Lawton, one of my colleagues today at True North, had an Open Media representative on his show, and it turns out that they just had total disagreement on basically everything, except for the fact that the government shouldn't be censoring the internet. So with all that in mind, I think it's important to show people that their people are the ones talking about it too. It's not just conservatives. It's not just liberals. It's people who are on the other side of the issue. Lastly, as well, in this environment, video is becoming an increasingly powerful tool. People just don't believe the written word as much as they used to anymore. When you show people video, when you show people the actual people in charge speaking and then contradicting themselves in the next clip, that is really powerful too. So see if you can get your hands on some video clips. I put some here together, and I will be able to hopefully send that to Freedom Defense Canada if you guys want to have access to those clips as well. But try and get your hands on video. That's really powerful stuff and does go a long way in terms of shifting people's opinions.
Okay, Mike has a question here or an addition to his original statement. So I'll read the whole thing. In your view, what can resistance look like for us in our present situation? What can we do to push back against this agenda? How can we opt out or avoid this direction? So how do we show our disagreement with it? I'm sort of reminded of what they're doing, the young are doing in China, which is just lying flat, or not doing anything more than they absolutely have to, or hoping that the system will rot. But how can we opt out? Because it may be time to do that.
Yeah, it's really difficult. The old answer would be, well, just go to free speech platforms, your Rumble, for example, or your other video platforms that stand for free speech and don't have the censorship that these big tech platforms have. But our problem right now is not just with big tech, it's with the government. And in order for these other free speech platforms like Rumble to be operating in Canada, they actually have to comply with the CRTC as well. I mean, it's really a big problem. How to fight back? Well, I look at the Freedom Convoy as an example for this. A lot of people see the Freedom Convoy, at least for me, I see the Freedom Convoy as being immensely successful. Not only did it put Canada really on the map, but think about it, the fight was against vaccine mandates, and provinces across the country knew that they had reached the end of their line with the public. They were offside with the public, and they dropped those mandates. It's kind of old school, but I think protesting in the right way, in the way that it was done during the Freedom Convoy, for example, a quintessentially Canadian way, is immensely powerful. So it's tough. I don't know if the checking out option that we're seeing in China is the way to go. I think our young people need to seize the day and seize the moment and really help this country get back on its track. And that won't happen by giving up playing video games and kind of just essentially tossing it in and forgetting about it. So it's tough. I think what really has to happen is we all have to be aware of what's going on. We can't have the situation we have now, which is life is so difficult in this country. Everyone is focused on just getting by, and the rate of change, the rate on which our freedoms are being taken away from us is so fast, we can't keep up. Once we realize what C11 is all about, C18 gets passed. And before we fully get to grips with C18, C36 comes back, online harms comes back, and we'll be hauled in front of a human rights tribunal. I think it's really about civics, paying attention to what's going on, getting to grips with everything, the details of it, and doing that as much as we can. And that's really the best way, because there's no way the public will just accept this is what's happening if everybody knew about it. I just don't think everybody does know about it.
Right. Good answer. Great answer. Another question here is, have you been following the debanking scandal in the United Kingdom, and do you think that could happen in Canada?
I absolutely have. The case of Nigel Farage at Coutts Bank is outrageous. They even admitted that the reason why he was debanked was because he was they had a term for it, a politically
person.
Right, exactly. It's absurd. And the reality is we've already seen it. There's a case of a guy named Jeremy Mackenzie in this country. He's a podcaster, sort of a shock jock podcaster, not everyone's cup of tea. I don't endorse everything he says. That being said, I endorse his right to have access to a bank in this country. And he has been debanked by Scotiabank simply because he is, in the same case as Nigel Farage, they think that he is a politically exposed person, that he is too dangerous to have as a Scotiabank customer. So it's already happening in this country. It hasn't happened to someone at the height and fame and notoriety of Nigel Farage, but it is happening to people like Jeremy Mackenzie. And the truth is, he is well known in this country. A lot of people listen to his podcast, and that sends a chilling effect on the rest of the country. It forces everyone to self-censor. It forces everyone to say to themselves, wow, I'm really not in a position to not have a bank account. I have a family to feed. I need my money. So it's really dangerous. Imagine the implications of the UK. People are now scared about what's happening in the UK. It can happen to us. The government seized people's bank accounts because they protested. Of course it can happen.
Yes, thanks for that. Couple of other questions here while we've got the time. One is a question from Rick here. Well, do you think digital IDs play a significant role in the implementation of 15-minute cities? By which he means, I think, are these two things going to be connected?
Well, I think so, because I think, as we've discussed, everything is going to be connected. Once your purchases are tracked using your central bank digital currency, which if you're living in Quebec is going to be part of your wallet, or in BC, part of your digital wallet, well, of course it can be tracked. And if you start making purchases outside of your 15-minute city, well, then there you go. You're in trouble. You're in violation of that 15-minute city. Now, the 15-minute city thing is a serious problem. We talked about the UK. Well, it looks as though Sadiq Khan in London is trying to do that with his ULEZ zones. The only good thing to come out of the ULEZ zones in particular is that there is large-scale dissent against it. You've got, I don't endorse public vandalism, but you've got the Blade Runners just basically taking out every ULEZ camera that gets put up in the greater London area. I think the 15-minute city thing is coming. But if the reaction can be the same as we're seeing in London, it's going to be a political issue where conservatives are going to realize it's politically astute for us to be 100% opposed to that. And once that is in place, then you've got a good defense. Hopefully you can vote people in who are going to take this stuff away. But we have to pay attention to it. It's all interconnected.
Thanks very much. So from Edward, there's a very interesting point he's brought up here. It's kind of a fine line in censorship between crass ad hominem videos and stuff like that, and just the suppression of points of view. So he's writing here and asks a question: is there any aspect of censorship with which we can agree? For example, vulgar or crass videos or ad hominem videos.
Well, I think there are places we can agree. It is dangerous, but it is important. I think that, for example, pornography content should be censored on social media. It's obviously it's not good for anybody. In particular, when that involves children, that should be censored from the internet. That should be completely unavailable. And actually, the people who upload that should be tracked down by the big tech. The problem is, I'm a free speech absolutist in the sense that I think some of the worst words should be allowed to be spoken, and they should be allowed to be posted, because I believe that it's a slippery slope. Once you go down a path of censoring speech that is everyone can agree is terrible, racist, extremely derogatory, bullying. Once you start going down that path, to pull the reins back when we all agree we've crossed a line, well, that's really tough, because everyone then has their own definition. Everybody's definition is slightly different. Now, that being said, I think we can all agree on certain pieces of content, videos, that should not be seen. I don't think it brings anybody any value, for example, to see people dying on video. And of course, child pornography content. That is something I think we can agree on, but it's a slippery slope when you start to get into specifically words. That's the dangerous part.
Okay, thanks. Guys, I think we're going to go to open mic now. So if you have a question you want to ask him directly, please get that question ready. And as I said before, if you go to the reactions section, you can raise your hand as I'm showing you right now, and the yellow hand will come up. And you can also have the function of lowering your hand. So if anybody would like to go to open mic, I'll just scan through people here. And at this point, we don't have any hands coming up.
Go to your hand.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, Patricia. Yeah, you have your hand up. All right, go ahead, please, with your question for Harrison.
Well, it's Edward.
Oh, I'm sorry, Edward. Okay.
What would we think of pro-Nazi video or wildly pro-Palestinian anti-Semitic programs?
Well, that's a good question. I think, again, everybody can agree that sort of content is terrible. But it's a matter of whether or not we want to criminalize that or to censor that. It's the same argument with whether or not we want to criminalize, for example, Holocaust denial. My colleague Andrew Lawton has spoken at length about this. Once you decide to criminalize that sort of speech, once you decide to make that decision, you've kicked a ball down the road that is very hard to stop it from eventually taking out other forms of speech with which we can all agree shouldn't be censored. So it's a very difficult question. My opinion is that, videos that glorify Nazis, videos that glorify Hamas, for example, I think it's very dangerous for us to completely censor those or to criminalize those. Now, that being said, a lot of this content is already being deranked and delisted by big tech, which I think is acceptable because a private company can do what they want to do. It's when you get into the instance of when the government says, the government says this is going to be banned. That, I think, is where we're into a dangerous territory. So it's a good question. It's dicey territory, but I always want to end up on the side of freedom. I always want to end up on the side of free speech, even if I disagree with that content deeply.
Thanks. Great question. Okay. I think at this point, I don't see any more questions. We still have the raised hand from Edward here. So we're at 8:30. I think perhaps you could remove my spotlight, Jackie, and go to Mike. Okay.
Okay, you hear me again. There we go. Thank you, everyone. That was excellent, stimulating. I appreciate your questions and putting Harrison in the hot seat for a few minutes there. Thank you, Harrison, for just your engagement and also just the way that you responded to the questions. There's much for us to consider, much for us to think about. But Harrison, it's been really great to have you this evening, so thank you so much. Thank you also, everyone, for your attendance. We appreciate each one of you. Before you go, I have a few things I want to mention, 3 actions that you can take as attendees. First of all, if you're not a member already, please join FDC. The information for joining is on the website. Secondly, check out and engage on our social media platforms, Rumble, Substack, Facebook, and YouTube. By the way, since we're new to Substack and Rumble, the links for those are in the chat box there. So you can get them from the chat box, or if you're unsure about that, you can email us at freedomdefensecanada@gmail.com. We'll send you a link. And finally, if you appreciate our work, please consider donating to FDC. So on that note, once again, great thanks to Harrison for joining us, and to each of you for being part of it. You guys were a wonderful audience, and appreciated your questions. So we thank you for your support and look forward to future events with you. Harrison, pass on our gratitude and thanks and our greetings to the rest of the staff at True North. We appreciate you and commend you in your work you're doing. You are doing the work of soldiers on the front line, and we are grateful for that. So keep it up. And other than that, from the board of Freedom Defense Canada, we want to thank you and wish you all a good evening. So good night and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Harrison.